Thank you so much. What a wonderful way to start a lecture. That was noisy, wasn't it? Sorry. But with song and prayer and that kind of meditation, it really is a privilege to be here and to deliver these lectures. Now, it looks like someone took my lecture with them. That would be Gordon. This was going to be very short and impromptu, but yeah, that was a good recovery. Thanks, Gordon. So we're following the general topic of toleration and the Reformation. Now tonight I'm taking a slightly different tack from the other two lectures and examining Swiss Anabaptism in particular. The historian Robert Scribner has noted that although religious intolerance was a prevailing attitude in the 16th century, in 16th century Europe, nevertheless, there were numerous manifestations of toleration that are visible in the historical sources. And for tonight's lecture, I've chosen to examine Swiss Anabaptism as a case study, testing Scribner's thesis. Because although acts of repression and violence against the Anabaptists are well known and well documented, a careful study of the sources demonstrates a little-known story, which is the survival of Swiss Anabaptism over the course of the 16th century and beyond was due in large part thanks to acts of toleration. I have to tell you that when I was collecting the translation documents for the book that was mentioned here, the later writings of the Swiss Anabaptists, I realized there's no history of Swiss Anabaptism over the whole century. We know an awful lot about the first few years, Zurich, Assay, Grabel, Mons, Blaurock, everybody knows who I'm talking about. You can't tell me one story, I'll bet, from after 1532. Tell me one story of Swiss Anabaptism after that date, and you draw a blank. So I started researching to write an introduction to that source volume, on a history of Swiss Anabaptism. I hit about 200 pages plus for this introduction, and John Roth told me to call it off. My friend John Roth, he said, this is not an introduction, write a different one and do a book instead. So I've drawn on some of those sources, and I hope, if God gives strength, to finish that history of Swiss Anabaptism maybe in the next couple of years, I don't know. I've got 200 pages written anyway. But in any case, I thought I learned a lot about Swiss Anabaptism in doing that research, so I'm really drawing on that work for tonight's lecture. We know very well that the first baptisms happened in Felix Manz's mother's house near the cathedral in Zurich on or about January 21st, 1525. And we know very well that Anabaptism spread quickly in the surrounding Swiss countryside to Basel, Bern, Solothurn, St. Gallen, Appenzell. And it's a familiar story also to recount how Zurich imposed the death penalty by drowning already in 1526, and they killed Felix Manz in the Limmat River in 1527. In fact, there's a plaque there by the river in Zurich now. When you go visit, you can see more or less the spot where he was drowned. There are stories to tell, though, later about the later Anabaptists who continued to live in Switzerland, but they're buried in the archives and they're hard to access. Now, Anabaptism was outlawed early and often in all the Protestant and Catholic states of the Swiss Confederation and beyond. So the question is, how did Anabaptists manage to survive in Switzerland over the course of the 16th century and beyond? First, a bit of context. So this is a bit of history I have to do in order to set the stage. Ulrich Zwingli, who was a reformer of Zurich, set the basic direction for Reformation in the Swiss territories. And although in some of his early writings, Zwingli, like Luther, argued that governments had no power to legislate church matters or matters of faith and conscience, nevertheless, his vision of reform was not individualistic, unlike what Luther seemed to say, but rather Zwingli looked to reform all of society. His model was Old Testament Israel, and his vision of reform was theocratic, namely God rules over the whole of society. He thought there should be one covenanted community under God. The sword of government would be borne by the magistrates. But in Zwingli's vision, the magistrates would be directed by the prophet, that is, the pastor, the head minister, whose task it was to interpret God's will for the whole community, for the whole covenanted community. So in other words, Zwingli envisioned the leader of the church guiding the entire civil and religious enterprise according to biblical standards, interpreted by the prophet. Beginning in 1518, when he started preaching in Zurich, Zwingli managed to bring about reform to the entire canton of Zurich in the space of 7 years, a very expert preaching and very expert exertion of political influence. He held no seat on city council. Nevertheless, he had considerable political power in Zurich, to the point of encouraging Zurich to confront the Catholic cantons economically and militarily. And the result eventually was war. The First Kappel War of 1529 saw Protestant forces lining up against Catholic forces, and the Protestants vastly outnumbered the Catholic fighters. And much to Zwingli's disappointment, the whole thing was concluded without a battle taking place. That is, they negotiated a settlement, and he was very disappointed because the Protestants would have won, hands down. He continued to maneuver and to push for a war. The Second Kappel War took place in 1531, 2 years later, at Zurich's initiative and Zwingli's encouragement, but with little support from the other Protestant states. The Second Kappel War didn't go well for the Protestants. It came to bloodshed and resulted in the defeat of the Protestant cantons, even though on paper they were way more powerful than the rural Catholic cantons. And Zwingli himself famously died on that field of battle, wearing armor and carrying a sword. Now, in the aftermath of the disaster at Kappel, the evangelical states resolved they would never again allow the prophets to dictate political events. Zwingli got blamed mightily for the disaster at Kappel. The Confederation, Swiss Confederation, managed to survive because they agreed the Protestant states could stay Protestant and the Catholic states would stay Catholic, but they would all still form the Swiss Confederation. They had common enemies, mainly the Austrians. In Zurich, it fell to Pastor Heinrich Bullinger, who's a much less known person. It fell to Bullinger to carry out the implications of Zwingli's theocratic vision. Except he had to agree in the aftermath of Kappel that the prophets would be silent on political matters and would not participate in government or instigate any more unrest, as they called it. He conceded that the magistrate alone had the power to establish religion and discipline. So Zwingli's vision of a covenant community governed by the prophet now gets switched, and it's still a covenant community, but it's the magistrates who govern both. And increasingly, they integrated the church into the state structure. Now, the details vary from state to state, but after 1531, in all of the Swiss evangelical states, that's Zurich, Bern, Basel, Schaffhausen, St. Gallen, all of them continued to promote the idea of covenant community, their state as a covenant community, and they consistently subordinated their churches to the power of the magistrates. The state became the final arbiter of church affairs. Now, this process, historians now call the process of confessionalization. It was happening all across Europe as states began to co-opt their churches and to use the church as an agent of the state. Church reform in Protestant Swiss states followed a very unique path, and it followed the path that Zurich laid out first. There wasn't any great demand from the masses for Reformation. But Reformation happened because a few powerful people in the urban centers decided that reform should happen. So the city councils of the evangelical states decreed new church structures and forms of worship for their territories as a whole, urban and rural. This was reform from the top down, or if you wish, from the center out. And the strength of this kind of reform was that it could happen quickly. Powerful people at the center could decide, and there it was. The weakness was the slow implementation of true reform and the lengthy process that was needed to convince the population at large. So bear this in mind. When we talk about reform in Switzerland, we're talking about reform that happened by decree from the centers of power. The most obvious change came in the legislated removal of images and paintings of the saints and the Blessed Virgin. These were the so-called idols, and the whitewashing of churches. Now, this was a dramatic change, obviously, in a Catholic state. And changes in liturgy. The Mass disappeared by mandate. And priests were replaced by Reformed pastors, who were mandated by the city council to preach the gospel. Most significantly, moral and religious matters, which used to be something the church looked after, now became civil matters. And there were legislated morals mandates, or Sittenmandaten, they were called. There's no other way to translate it other than morals mandates, that were civil laws put out by the magistrates in the city. Moral lapses were now dealt with by a civil court and not by the church as such. Church attendance was required legally of all citizens, and it was up to local pastors, nominated by the church synod, but appointed by city council, to promote the new church and the Sittenmandaten in the villages and rural territories. But the fact was that in the early going especially, able Reformed pastors were few and far between, and I'll say more about that in a minute. Now, in terms of establishing the covenant society, I can just talk you through this because time is short. It looked something like this in the Reformed Swiss states. The city council and its court were at the top of the pyramid, if you will, at the center of power. If we start with the civil arm, we see that in the rural districts, the bailiffs, or the Vogt, were appointed by council. They were sometimes supported by under bailiffs. There was a morals officer whose job it was to make sure that the Sittenmandaten were being followed, and the church warden who looked after church property and church income and so forth, the Kirchenpfleger. These were all appointed by the central magistrates in Zurich, in this case, or Basel or Bern, it doesn't matter. They all worked in the same way. Now, on the religious side, the church side, the pastors were appointed by the city council. They were nominated by the synod, but appointed by the city council. The synod was created in 1528 and reorganized in 1532. The head of the synod was the head of the Zurich church, in the case of Zurich, and the mayor. So you see the combination of civil and religious authority over the clergy. When you move into the parishes, the parish structure remained the same as it had been in the Roman Catholic era. The pastors moved into the parish church with their wives and children now. They were supported by church living, church taxes, which were collected from the population at large. Those were collected now by the city instead of the bishop, and the pastors were paid by the city. They were actually city employees. An important church official was the Kirchenpfleger. He kept church accounts and so forth. And the minister and the pastor would try to solve any conflicts that came up sort of on a personal basis whenever they could. If they failed, the cases were then taken into Zurich and to the central court, and the city court would decide how these were to be solved. The historian Bruce Gordon has summarized the structure of this covenant community as a confluence of secular and ecclesiastical authority. In the Swiss evangelical states after 1532, the church became integrated, fundamentally integrated with the state, institutionally and structurally. But the reality was that the city's ability to exercise authority weakened the further one moved out from the center and got out to the edges. Now, from the start, the Anabaptists resisted any government interference in their churches. Their numbers were few, and they lived primarily in the villages and the rural areas, but they remained the most significant impediment to the state's desire to impose religious unity, to impose just one church in their states. Anabaptists and Anabaptism offered a grassroots alternative to centralized church reform from above. Now, part of the reason Anabaptists could survive was that they resided at the periphery of power rather than at the center. Now, the basic legislation that needed to be monitored by ministers, morals officers, and bailiffs, and by the way, all of these officials that you see on the chart here, all of them had to swear an oath to the magistrates that they would carry out their duties. And they swore that they would do that, including pastors. Now, the basic legislation is the morals mandates, the Sittenmandaten, which were set out as civil laws by the magistrates. They're very interesting because they give us a snapshot of the problems that these folks are trying to solve, right? You don't make a law if there isn't a problem. The Sittenmandaten that were published in Bern in 1529 prohibited a long list of moral offenses. And here, just have a look at this one. What's prohibited? Well, gambling, swearing, blasphemy, inappropriate clothing, drinking, licentiousness, marital conflict, impiety, unbelief, magic, superstition, dancing, child abuse. You think they're Mennonites, huh? Dancing, child abuse, gambling, and jewelry. Every member of the community was expected to attend church. It was a law. You had to attend church. Bring your children to baptism. Partake in the celebration of the supper. And most importantly, when worship is happening, you're forbidden to wander around in the streets. You can't hang out in the tavern. You can't conduct business. And you can't stay in bed. This is a law. Right? Now, the Sittenmandat that was published in Zurich the next year in 1530 contained virtually all these same prohibitions, but it included a specific set of prohibitions that against the erring sect of Anabaptists. Everyone is to attend the state church and listen to the preachers without contradicting or insulting them. Apparently that was happening. No one was to consort with Anabaptists, attend their meetings, or offer such people help. Anabaptists were not to be tolerated in the land, the mandate emphasized. That's an interesting phrase, not to be tolerated. In particular, all those who held sworn offices over and under bailiffs, officials, wardens, judges, morals officials, pastors, all were strongly exhorted to be true to their oaths and immediately turn over known Anabaptists for judgment. My point, there was ample legislation in place from 1530 on to completely eradicate the Anabaptists. All the legal pieces were there. In fact, all of the people were there in place with oaths that they would, in fact, obey these mandates. So how did the Anabaptists survive? As you can see in the morals legislation, the pastors were now expected to play a central role in policing community behavior, along with carrying out their religious duties. According to the constitution of the Zurich Synod, a pastor who failed in his appointed duties would be disciplined by the synod. The duties of the pastor were this, and it's a long list: learning or education, extirpation of false belief in the parish, reading the council's mandates from the pulpit, care of the poor, guarding against blasphemy, upholding the oath in the community, regular worship, teaching of the catechism, education of children, visiting the sick, burial of the dead, and maintenance of a proper household. Is that what pastors have to do? I don't know. It sounds like a long list. It's a much longer list than we would expect. And soon added to this list was the requirement that pastors were to keep careful written records of births, baptisms, marriages, and deaths. So the city magistrates obviously could easily identify Anabaptists. If you didn't bring your child to be baptized, the flags went up. So the pastors could pinpoint who were and who weren't Anabaptists just by keeping track of these things. Also, Anabaptists didn't come to church to be married. They had their own marriages. Now, in the countryside and the villages, it was clear that the Reformed pastors were agents of the city, as well as being religious leaders. And they were caught in the middle of a very difficult situation, as you can imagine. They needed to preach salvation to their parishioners. They had to educate them in the new faith, but at the same time, they were sworn to exhort their parishioners to civil obedience. They had to keep records for the civil authorities. They had to read the latest civil mandates and laws and pronouncements of the magistrates from the pulpit, and they were bound by oath to turn in their own parishioners to the authorities when failures occurred. Now, the fact is that the vast majority of these newly minted evangelical parish preachers were still the same men who had been local Roman Catholic priests. I don't know if you knew that or not. They were still supported by the same hated church tithe, which is really a tax, as before, only now the city administered it rather than the bishop. The data from Zurich show that there were about 167 clergymen in the rural parishes from 1523 to 1531. And a full 75% of these men had been Roman Catholic priests prior to the Reformation. Little had been done to determine the theological orientation of these newly minted Reformed pastors or prepare them for their new roles. The main criterion was, were they willing to swear obedience to the city council? If they were accepted, and from that day on, they were Reformed pastors rather than Roman Catholic priests. The historian Bruce Gordon has said, the Reformed churches had little control over their clergy, most of whom had little knowledge of the new faith and even less sense of how to preach. So in a word, the Reformed city-states had declared a Reformation, but they inherited a church structure that was populated by pastors who often lacked pastoral gifts or a profound commitment to Reformation principles. Very often, these pastors brought with them many of the same personal problems they had had as priests. Bruce Gordon has also done a very interesting study of clerical discipline in the Zurich Synod for a period of about 50 years, up to 1580. And he's sort of summarized these cases of discipline. Out of 193 cases brought before the Synod, reveals that drunkenness was the most common charge against the pastors, along with poor education, inadequate preaching skills, unruly families, some cases of adultery, some cases of failure to appear in the church, and so forth. Now, to take one notable example, one that I particularly like, there's a village called Bulach, north of Zurich. It's actually just not far from the airport. If you fly into Zurich, you're close. You probably fly over Bulach. It remained an Anabaptist stronghold throughout the century. The first evangelical preacher in Bulach was a man named Ulrich Rollenbutz. And he just continued to occupy the same pulpit he had occupied before as a Roman Catholic priest. So it wasn't anything new there. In January 1528, Rollenbutz wrote a detailed letter of complaint to the overseer of his territory. He reported that local Anabaptists were saying that they were the ones preaching the gospel and that the preachers were preaching lies. He complained no one was coming to the Lord's Supper anymore, and he was afraid that rebellion was being fomented among the common people. He sort of scared up images of the Peasants' War being brewed up. Now, that was Rollenbutz's side of the story. It's apparent that he faced a parish full of Anabaptists. It was common knowledge who they were, and local authorities were not acting expeditiously to move against them. There's actually no evidence that there was a political rebellion afoot. That seems to be his own invention, fear-mongering. Now, the other side of the ledger shows that Rollenbutz was a bombastic man. He was already fined as a Roman Catholic priest in 1520 for swearing at and insulting his parishioners. This is when he was a priest still. When his letter of complaint resulted in some arrests in 1528, one member of his now reformed parish in Bulach, he testified in court. He was not an Anabaptist. This man said that Rollenbutz shouts and yells in the chancel so much that even those who are not Anabaptists don't like it and walk out of church and have no idea what the pastor's saying. Now, this parishioner, again not an Anabaptist, concluded by saying that since the pastor didn't follow his own teaching with works, he had no interest in going to church. And one other record of Rollenbutz is in 1533. He's now in another parish. He was called before the synod and disciplined there. He had to explain why his children were systematically stealing from people in the parish. He had an unruly household. Now, you might imagine local Anabaptist teachers, and there was one in this district, the illiterate Anabaptist named Conrad Winkler, did a lot of recruiting in Bulach. He had very little difficulty making headway there. One of the Anabaptist witnesses who was arrested around 1530 reported that Winkler was teaching that our preachers mislead the common people and are sinners and can bring forth no good fruit with their teaching and are not able to preach the truth because they have benefices. Essentially, he argued that they were being paid by the state. They were mercenaries. Now, it was easy to make that kind of argument stick when the local Reformed pastor, installed and maintained in his position by the city, supported by the hated tithe, which is a church tax, was somebody as ill-suited to being a pastor as obviously Ulrich Rollenbutz was. These kinds of problems persisted here and there throughout the 16th century in the Protestant states. In 1602, the case of Jakob Muscheln, pastor in Kilchberg, was brought before the provincial synod in Basel. A neighboring pastor reported that Muscheln frequented the local inn daily and periodically got so drunk that he would vomit over the tables and insult all of those present. Some people had composed a little song about him. It was being sung here and there. He also was said to be greedy, with a loose tongue and evil ways. And many churchgoers had stopped attending at Kilchberg and were attending at the nearby church in Gelterkinden. Now, Hans-Peter Jecker notes that having a preacher like this as representative of the official church undoubtedly helped recruit Anabaptists. And certainly you can see how that would be the case. In the villages in the countryside, Anabaptists came from among the common people, and they lived alongside them and were integrated working members of their communities. And they were community insiders. And as such, they were able to articulate local reforming aspirations and grievances, such as the grievance about the tithe, and were able to exploit weaknesses in the early reforming system. Now, central among these was a kind of lingering rural mistrust of the big city magistrates and the preachers that these city people chose to install in the rural parishes. The Anabaptist grassroots dissidents, they were called corner preachers of Winkelpredigen. They were not educated, they were not educated, but they put forward simple and coherent biblical arguments. And they lived visibly devout lives for the most part and carried out a pointed social and religious critique. Now, the fact that Zurich captured Konrad Winkler and put him to death in 1530 did not stop the movement of dissent in Bulach and the surrounding territory, because almost 2 decades later, there were still Anabaptist congregations meeting regularly there. And there's a document translated in the book that I can't wave for you, but in the later writings, chapter 3, we have a document from the 1550s that documents this, the presence of Anabaptist congregations there. Now, one of the things that we've mentioned in earlier lectures was also true in the Swiss testimonies. From the start, the baptizers rejected that sinners are saved only and exclusively by faith in Christ's sacrifice. In fact, if such visible obedience to Christ was absent, then the claimed faith, they said, is not truly faith. And they love to quote the verse that Martin Luther detested, which was James 2:17, faith without works is dead. It was one of their favorite verses. Now, there's ample evidence from Swiss sources that most Anabaptists there did in fact lead Reformed lives, although there were exceptions, of course. A typical testimony comes from a witness from Basel named Germain Berchi. Although he was not himself an Anabaptist, he praised the Anabaptists as pious, God-fearing people who do no one any harm. There are no other people who lead a finer way of life. He wishes he could be a true Anabaptist as well, but it's too difficult. He was not an Anabaptist. But he was going around talking up the Anabaptists, and he got arrested for it. Leonhard Meyer, also not an Anabaptist, declared his admiration for the way in which the Anabaptist community disciplined members who did something wrong. The Reformed pastors answered back that the Anabaptists were not really devout, they were just excellent hypocrites. The theological charge was that Anabaptists were trying to be saved by their works, which was, of course, the Roman Catholic error. Some historians have concluded that the rural areas of Switzerland remained essentially Roman Catholic in piety, especially in the early part of the century. Among such people, the pious living of the Anabaptists hardly resonated as a huge theological mistake, but rather the opposite. If many members of the Reformed Church and even some pastors were living much as before, swearing, gambling, drunk, and the like, then this was hardly a Reformed church in the common understanding of reform. It was more like a continuation of what had been before with cosmetic changes. That this was the church that was officially tolerated and promoted by the magistrates only added to the mystery. It made little sense among people at the grassroots that a group of subjects who were visibly upright, moral, and devout, just as it was mandated by the Sittenmandaten, in fact, the Anabaptists more or less lived by what the Sittenmandaten required, would nevertheless be condemned, jailed, exiled, persecuted, and even killed. Where did evangelical reform really reside? Well, arguments from observed life were more effective among the simple people than sophisticated theological nuances about the workings of divine grace. And the argument of well-lived life had the advantage of appealing to a very well understood tradition of Catholic piety in the grassroots. The first of several pressing tasks Bullinger and other leading Swiss Protestant reformers faced was convincing the grassroots population that they needed to turn from Catholicism to an evangelical, biblically based faith. But the pastors also had to convince the rural people that they needed to embrace state-sponsored reform as the exclusive reforming option. The rural people had to be convinced not to tolerate their Anabaptist neighbors or to help in identifying, apprehending, or punishing them as dangerous heretics. And this proved difficult to do. Anabaptists were able to hide in plain sight in the villages and rural areas because they were tolerated and accepted by their neighbors and often actively protected from the authorities. One of my favorite stories illustrating this is when it came to light that the wife of a local under-bailiff had used her access to inside information to alert, get this, a Hutterite missionary who was hanging out in the village that an arrest was about to come. And this allowed him about 5 minutes to get out of the house and up into the woods and avoid arrest. This was not the first time, certainly, that this woman used this kind of inside information to warn Anabaptists of what was about to happen. In an important observation that holds for all Swiss villages and rural territories, the Swiss historian Martin Haas has pointed to the unique social structure of the countryside, where Freundschaft networks determined primary relationships. Freundschaft included family, it means family to us, but included family, extended family, but also neighbors and friends with whom one had a special emotional commitment and bond, and primary loyalty. When local civil officials, that is bailiffs, judges, and others, included Anabaptists in their Freundschaft, as they very often did, the officials faced a very real conflict. Are you going to go against your Freundschaft because you got orders from somebody in Zurich? Not likely. The Solothurn records contain one spectacular example of this dynamic. I like it a lot. Junker Rudolf von Rohl, bailiff of Beckburg, repeatedly failed to carry out his official duty to arrest Anabaptists because it was alleged he was bound by ties to his Freundschaft. Already in March 1535, the order went out to the bailiff to arrest Hans Bury, the well-known Anabaptist. The bailiff ignored the order. And it's clear because continued messages came from the authorities in Solothurn. According to a letter that was sent to the neighboring bailiff, the bailiff of Falkenstein, von Rohl was related to the Bury family. Solothurn asked this neighboring bailiff to step in and intervene since von Rohl wouldn't act, but he didn't do it. In the case of Hans Bury, von Rohl's relative, direct orders for his arrest and punishment were successfully ignored for 37 years. 37 years. Hans Bury died in 1572 as a well-known, unrepentant, and unpunished Anabaptist. His family requested burial in the church graveyard. Solothurn wanted him to be buried under the gallows, but said, well, you can bury him in the graveyard if you pay 100 gulden for the privilege. They made some money out of the deal. But as this case demonstrates, the reach of official power was limited by the willingness of local officials to follow orders. Laws could not be enforced locally when people valued their loyalty to each other more than obedience to orders from a distant state. In the Toggenburg district in 1553, a group of Anabaptists was arrested, along with their leader, Jakob Mahler, and his wife. The latter were arrested and expelled, and their property was confiscated. But local district officers had extended Freundschaft connections among the Anabaptist prisoners. Amann Schmuckli, who was a local officer, was related to Els Schmucklin from Ruti, whom the records list as an Anabaptist. Anton Moch, who was district officer for Bischwil, had a sister who was identified as an Anabaptist. Now, you couldn't expect expedient action when local civil officials were asked to prosecute members of their Freundschaft. And local councilors noted that they also have the support of many of the people in the territory. Now, in the light of the surviving evidence, it appears that the Anabaptists who were imprisoned in 1553 were treated with very great leniency. Some conditional sentences were handed out, and the prisoners were released. And some of these people became very adept at evading the law. The district officer, Anton Moch, stood surety for Othmar Reifer's Anabaptist sister, and he obtained her release from prison. But she continued as a practicing Anabaptist and also failed to appear at subsequent hearings. So as surety, Moch had to come in before the magistrates. He was supposed to see that she complied with the law and appear in court. His excuse to the court was that she was ill and could not appear. He was charged with action if he failed to bring her to the next meeting. The time of the next meeting, she was still ill, apparently, he said, and he had not delivered, so the threats were repeated. Els from Ruti gave the Toggenburg magistrates absolute fits. The district officer, Buihofer, and a miller from Boxberg stood surety for her, and she was released from prison. But the local morals officer noted she refused to recant and kept visiting Anabaptists. She was cited before the court. She didn't appear. Her sureties came before the court and assured the court that she was ill, apparently infected with an Anabaptist flu that flared up just as court hearings were scheduled. At the May hearing, she again failed to appear. The sureties told the court she's not at home or in the territory. They didn't know where she was. Finally, the next year, the cases were reviewed again. There were more threats of action. But in the end, the court turned over these Anabaptist released prisoners to their Freundschaft, and I'm quoting the records, they say, we'll turn them over to their Freundschaft as sureties with the order that the Freundschaft instruct their Anabaptist relatives and make them go to church along with other obedient subjects, and if not, a capital sentence was threatened. Now, there's no record of any such action ever being taken. It appears that the Toggenburg officials were reluctant, or probably more likely unable, to take stern action in the face of Freundschaft opposition. Because following this concentration of imprisonments and court actions and non-appearances in court, covering about 2 years, there's no further record of action. The records show that the Bernese authorities also struggled to enforce their mandates, with local officials continually throwing sand in the gears of official policy. The summer of 1535, 300 Anabaptists were reported in and around Schlossrud, at that time in the jurisdiction of the Lenzburg bailiff. Bern was anxious to have them arrested. It didn't happen. In 1538, Anabaptists in Aarau, Zofingen, Lenzburg, and Brugg were reported to be wandering around freely in taverns and public places. Bern called on local officials to prosecute them and apply appropriate legal measures. It didn't happen. And so it went. The problem was not finding the Anabaptists. Everybody knew who they were. Repeated reminders were sent to the bailiffs in Lenzburg and Aarau, Zofingen, and Brugg from 1535 to 1550, ordering them to enforce Anabaptist obedience. In fact, 10 years later, Bern was continuing to send reminders to the same officials in those territories. The Anabaptists were hiding in plain sight, if you will. It was getting them to the city court via the available legal channels that was the problem. One of my favorite stories, in 1574, a man named Stefan Zender, who was assistant bailiff for Esch in the Zurich district, was arrested and brought to Zurich. It turns out he had set Anabaptists free from prison. In his defense, he said, and I find this hard to believe, but this is what he claimed, that he had never heard that their preaching was against the magistrate's law or against our faith. It was news to him. He believed his job was just to punish vices, which is kind of a sly reference to the fact that Anabaptists didn't have them. They were living devout lives. Zender managed to be released after an oath and a fine. This is an under bailiff, apparently convincing the magistrates in Zurich that he hadn't known that his civil duties included arresting pious Anabaptists. Now, one way for the city magistrates to break the impasse posed by reluctant officials and Freundschaft networks was to rely on people who were not connected to the local community. Pastors appointed by the city were such persons. Perhaps for this reason, it was usually pastors and almost never local civil officials who turned over disobedient parishioners to the city authorities for discipline. Usually they tried to persuade them first to convert. Still, it was the pastors who were the effective police for the city magistrates, and certainly this hardly endeared them to the grassroots. It cemented their role as employees of the city-state rather than as pastors concerned with the spiritual nurture of their flocks. A second, more deadly way to break through the local Freundschaft barrier was to hire Anabaptist hunters, Täuferjäger. These were essentially mercenaries with no kinship ties to local people. They were just paid people hunters. There's a long trail records in the extant Bernese historical records showing the monies that were paid to these Täuferjäger. Some of them earned very handsome sums arresting and turning in Anabaptists. And perhaps it was Bern's use of the Anabaptist hunters that put Bern, in fact, in the lead among Swiss states for executions. Namely, there were 49 Anabaptists put to death in the 16th century in Bern. Bullinger and the Swiss reformers also faced difficult task in convincing the city magistrates to act vigorously in prosecuting the religious dissenters. The city magistrates, that is in the main city councils in Zurich, Bern, Basel, and other places, only showed sporadic interest in trying to eradicate this small baptizing movement. It took a lot of energy, took a lot of money, took a lot of people. And most of the time, if things were peaceful, they just didn't care. Just let it be, because it's not a problem. One case in point, Andreas Gut, if you look at chapter 14 in the later writings, you'll see Andreas Gut's writing. Andreas Gut and the future Anabaptist martyr Hans Landis, who was the last Anabaptist to be martyred in Switzerland in 1612. They were arrested in 1589, along with others. And the preachers came to the prison. They tried to convince them to recant. They didn't succeed again. When essentially the authorities walked away and left them locked up in the prison, and of course, very soon their friends broke them out of prison, as very often happened in the 16th century. They returned to their homes, went right back home, where they lived openly and undisturbed for 19 years. It's no secret where they were. They went back home. The Zurich authorities could have gone there and rearrested them. They didn't see the point. So they lived without being arrested for 19 years. Oftentimes, the city magistrates chose to look the other way, much to the annoyance of the preachers, who became the most vocal champions of a stricter application of the law against Anabaptists. So it's not by accident that we read repeatedly in the Anabaptist writings, found in the later writings, the accusation that the pastors in particular were inciting the magistrates against them. Now, surviving records over the next decades give an increasingly sketchy picture of actual Anabaptist presence in Swiss territories. But it appears that lack of documentation indicates really a lack of official interest and keeping records, as it does lack of Anabaptists in Swiss lands. This is one of the drawbacks of an excessively empirical approach to Anabaptist history. The apparent benign neglect in Bernese lands changed in 1566. And it's marked by the adoption of a new Anabaptist mandate. In fact, the new mandate was just the old mandate that was reissued in 1566. But the Bernese authorities now were more hardline, and they were, in fact, going to apparently follow the mandates to the letter. Execution of backsliders was mandated again. And this new hardline city regime did in fact execute two more people. Welti Gerber was beheaded in 1566, and Hans Haslibacher, who was the last Anabaptist to be put to death in Bern, was executed in 1571. Now, these cases not only illustrate that Bern temporarily renewed its commitment to eradicate Anabaptists, but they also illustrate, by contrast, Bern's relatively mild policy toward Anabaptists in the 1540s and 50s. Because Welti Gerber was a known Anabaptist already in the 1530s, but he disappears from the record until he's rearrested in 1566. That's over 30 years. And he was described as a leading Anabaptist teacher. Obviously, Gerber did not interest the Bernese magistrates, or at least he's not visible in the records, for almost 3 decades, but he was there. A similar gap appears in the case of Hans Haslibacher. In fact, the Haslibacher Lied was added to the Ausbund in Pennsylvania in 1622, a song memorializing his martyrdom. Haslibacher first appears in the Bernese record as an Anabaptist in 1532, arguing with a preacher. Then there's no notice of him or record of his activity until 1561, when he's reported to be paying a yearly fine of £100 von den Täuferau wegen, because of Anabaptism. So they knew who he was. In 1560, 30 years later, they fine him for being an Anabaptist. He has to pay a yearly amount. And then comes the notice of his arrest in 1571, and then that ends with the report of his execution by the sword in October 1571. In the case of Hans Haslibacher, almost 40 years of underground Anabaptist activity lie hidden in the official record. If we just had the official record, we would think he disappeared after 1530. No, he hadn't. He was working underground, that is, he was not arrested for 40 years. But underground was not exactly out of sight. The officials knew where to find him, and he was visible enough to be assessed a yearly fine for Anabaptism a good decade before he was put to death by a kind of hardline magistracy. Now, the cases of Gerber and Haslibacher strongly suggest that the lack of official documentation must not be taken as hard empirical evidence that there was no Anabaptist activity, only that the Anabaptists remained successfully out of trouble, hidden in plain sight, probably because the authorities were happy not to have to deal with them. In Bern, as in Zurich and other Protestant states, the magistrates were trying in vain to find a way of getting rid of these people. And they vacillated between hardline responses and milder attempts, and then just giving up. Systematic toleration of dissent, as far as I can tell, was never considered as an option in either territory or any territory, as far as I can see. But Anabaptists who lived for decades, who managed to live hidden lives in plain sight, could do so because of de facto toleration. And they can be forgiven, I think, for at least imagining a permanent legal situation in which they would be tolerated as law-abiding dissidents. That didn't happen, but don't blame them for imagining that. They lived that way for many decades. Now, I should say a word. Klaus-Peter Clausen published a famous book back in the 60s, I believe it was, where he did a sort of statistical analysis of Anabaptists. He went through all the court records he could find and came to the conclusion that Anabaptism was insignificant because the numbers were so small. And I want to say a word about that. It's true that a statistical analysis of extant court records leads to the conclusion that Anabaptism in Switzerland was adopted by only a small percentage of the population. That's true. But the flip side of this observation is that Reformed attempts to gain committed support for evangelical religion in the broader rural population faced the same large numbers of uninterested people. Indifference to institutionalized reform is evident in the morals mandates that needed to be repeated, again, were issued repeatedly by the Swiss authorities throughout the 16th century. And particularly the injunctions that people had to attend sermons rather than the taverns, and that they should pay attention to the preachers rather than gossiping and being rude. It's worth remembering there had been no groundswell of popular support for church reform among the population at large. This was reform that was instituted from the center out. And the few people at the grassroots who were religiously sincere and zealous for biblical reform were the very same few persons that were needed in the reform camp. Many of these people were repelled by the lack of change the Reformation had brought, and were attracted precisely to Anabaptism because of the practical piety and ethical rigor of that group. Because this is, after all, what reform meant to most people, that you lived a reformed life, a new life. So the minority of religiously zealous people at the grassroots were receptive to the Anabaptist critique that Reformed preaching bore no fruit because Reformed churches were full of coerced, uncommitted members, listening, or more often not listening, to Reformed preachers who were state hirelings, not spiritual leaders. Turns out really that Bullinger and the Anabaptists were pursuing committed adherence within much the small demographic sample of people. Bullinger's many-sided problem with unreformed laity, substandard ministers, and reticent magistrates provides the context for the documents that are translated in the later writings. And what you read in the later writings is the Anabaptist side of the biblical argument in the ongoing battle for the hearts and minds of the small number of common folk in the Swiss countryside who actually had an ear for the reforming message. The huge encyclopedia of Anabaptist beliefs and teachings that was circulating in several copies in the 1580s and 90s, ironically called the Short, Simple Confession, is an example of the kind of thinking that was making its way among the simple people at the grassroots. Reviewing this document will not be our concern here, but anybody of you who have a few days to spare can read this page turner in chapter 12 of the later writings over the space of 275 gripping pages. Many more stories could be told. It's time to conclude, which doesn't mean I'm actually done, as you know by now. Anabaptist communities managed to survive in Protestant Swiss states in the 16th century thanks to a combination of factors, primary among which was the fact that they were tolerated and even protected in their local communities by people who knew them well. This is the form of toleration that Robert Scribner has called the tolerance of practical rationality. It's an obscure phrase, but what he means by it, we've seen demonstrated in the Swiss Anabaptist story, namely the tolerance of ordinary people, a tolerance that's found frequently in daily life, which made little fuss about the difference in belief and accepted it as a normal state of affairs, a kind of shrug of the shoulders. It was precisely this matter-of-fact toleration among ordinary people at the grassroots that the state church reformers had to overturn. They had to arouse an awareness of confessional difference, and they had to insist that their own church was the only acceptable one. Anabaptist communities also managed to survive because of the diminished interest by the leading city magistrates in pursuing a policy of complete eradication. Often there simply were not enough police to enforce conformity, and the lack of local cooperation from appointed local officials just underscored the problem. In addition to the devout lives most Swiss Anabaptists lived, at the risk of arrest, exile, and even execution, they also articulated an accessible biblical vision of reform that they were able to explain and defend and in fact live out convincingly. And it wasn't until the late 16th century and into the 17th that the Reformed educational effort had prepared enough pastors to reach into the villages and rural areas and successfully counter the dissident voices with effective catechetical teaching. And that's really what it took for reform to take over at the grassroots in Switzerland, was for educated Reformed pastors to go out and do a good job of educating the local people. This was not happening for most of the 16th century. Now, two observations and comments in conclusion. The story of Anabaptist survival in 16th century Switzerland has reminded me of Gene Sharp's book of 1973 called The Politics of Nonviolent Action, which we used to discuss a lot in peace and conflict classes in the 1980s. Sharp made the point that political power does not truly lay in the hands of those who stand in the centers of power, but is actually dependent on the obedience and compliance of the governed. As he pointed out, obedience is essentially voluntary. Consent can be withdrawn. Without the obedience of those standing down, lower down the chain of command, the commands from the center cannot and will not be carried out. That simply is a fact. The Swiss Anabaptist story is almost a case study of Sharp's point. It's full of instances of intolerance being mandated by those at the center of power and being routinely sabotaged at the grassroots by non-cooperation, disobedience, reticence, obfuscation, and other such methods. Perhaps the Swiss Anabaptist story can help us to be more mindful of what we're giving up when we acquiesce without resistance to demands that we adopt attitudes of intolerance towards others. Incremental resistance to unjust orders is more important than we might imagine. A second observation has to do with the importance of community. Intolerance can be fostered only when people being ostracized and demonized are not intimately known by a community. Intolerance mostly depends on fear of the unknown, which allows negative stereotypes to flourish. The Swiss Anabaptist story demonstrates the power of personal relationships, encountering attempts to demonize this particular group of people. Swiss people in the countryside knew very well that their Anabaptist neighbors were not Munsterites, they were not revolutionaries or people dangerous to society, even though that's the picture of them that the authorities repeatedly tried to depict. The resistance in the rural communities to demonizing attempts grew directly out of personal knowledge of the people being labeled. Perhaps those of us with an interest in discouraging the currents of intolerance that seem to be growing in our time should take a special interest in getting to know people in those groups that are being stereotyped and demonized from the centers of power. One example, it might be interesting to see what would happen if every Mennonite family befriended one local Muslim family. What would happen? The 16th century example of Anabaptism in Switzerland reminds us that toleration is not an ideal, but rather an attitude and a way of living that's put into practice imperfectly in historical circumstances according to the possibilities offered by time and place. I believe we certainly have possibilities open to us today if we choose to see them. Thank you very much.